When I teach the history of art crime, I look at different categories, forgery being just one of them. So the most serious thing in terms of the extent of it, how difficult it is to police, and how it funds bad things is illicit trade in antiquities.
Right.
So this is usually taking antiquities directly out of the earth in unofficial excavations that are not supervised by archaeologists. And that is by far the biggest problem. The objects that are taken have never existed before for modern humans, so we have no idea what to look for. And they can be sold on an open market or a gray market like online auction houses with forged paperwork that make them appear legal. And then they can be sold for something approaching the full price. And there have demonstrably been a funding source for terrorist groups. ISIS is the most obvious example. They were, showcasing it all over the internet. But we've known about this since 2007, at least, when at the Interpol Stolen Works of Art annual conference, there was a presentation given about the links between art and terrorist funding, particularly illicit trade of antiquities and fundamentalist Islamic terrorist groups. There's a really good documentary that shows how this works behind the scenes called Blood Antiques by a Belgian company called Journeyman Pictures. Yeah.
Okay.
And back in 2004, Der Spiegel in Germany broke the news that Mohammed Atta, who was one of the architects of the 9/11 attacks, had initially flown to Germany with Polaroids of looted antiquities that he was looking to sell. And when he was asked what he wanted to sell them for, he said to buy an airplane. And one of his early iterations of the 9/11 attack would have been to buy airplanes with funds generated by selling looted antiquities and then to crash those planes into buildings. And the hijacking option was a later iteration of the same plot. Prior to the war, the Nazis embarked on a campaign to gather what they called degenerate art, which was art that was created by people who were considered enemies of the state, which, Catholics, Jews, blacks, Freemasons, you name it. But they also used this policy to basically capture and seize objects that would be valuable to the government in funding the anticipated war effort. And they were seizing objects from German citizens, not just people who were enemies of the state. And some of the objects were collected and kept. Hitler had a huge stolen art collection. Hermann Goering, his second in command, did as well. But some of the choicest pieces that were of artistic importance but did not match the pro-Aryan agenda of the Nazis were put on display at a moving exhibition called the Degenerate Art Exhibition. And these objects were intentionally curated and hung in an unflattering way. And written on the wall when you walked in was a German equivalent of a phrase, saying, this is the sort of thing we are saving your children from. And it was meant to parade around things that the Nazis found objectionable. However, they also recognized that though they found them objectionable, that there was a market for them. And it was clear that they were going to be getting rid of these things. And many artworks were destroyed. But quite hypocritically, they recognize that, they shouldn't exist in our context, but if someone wants to pay us for them, they can. And so there was a series of auctions, and the most famous one you're mentioning was in Lucerne, Switzerland, where the objects were sold to anyone who wanted to buy, and there were a lot of American buyers, which is quite shameful. They knew where it was coming from. Superficially, paperwork was rigged, so it didn't look like it had been illegally seized from private citizens, but almost all of it had been. So there was only the most superficial veneer of subterfuge in terms of forging provenance for that auction house. Everyone knew where they were coming from, and some people just said this is too good a deal to pass up. And there was a concern that objects that weren't sold would be burned. And they did burn thousands of works of art that didn't sell, but they tried to sell them first. And they tried to sell them abroad, and a lot of Americans bought them.